Joining us now, member of the Senate Foreign Relations and Judiciary Committees, Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. He has a new piece in The Atlantic magazine entitled "The Senate Must Rein in Trump Unless Congress Acts. The Kurds May Not Be the Last Allies This President Abandons." So this is a really important message.
It's an important message. And obviously, Senator, Donald Trump has been attacking every ally that has served as a bulwark against Russian aggression, against autocratic aggression, whether you look at his constant attempts to undermine NATO, his constant attempts to undermine democratic allies across Europe, and now, of course, his abandonment of the Kurds, which in effect gives Vladimir Putin and Russia complete control of that region. I mean, they are now the kingmakers in that part of the Middle East.
That's right, Joe. What we've heard in terms of expressions of grave concern from current and former military leaders, from advisors from this administration and previous administrations, is that not only is this betrayal of the Kurds in northeastern Syria something that is a stain on America's record and has unleashed hundreds of hardened ISIS fighters and has advantaged Vladimir Putin and the murderous regime of Bashar al-Assad and the Iranians, as if that weren't bad enough. What I'm trying to point to in the piece I just published in The Atlantic is we now have to take a hard look at what other circumstances around the world might lead an impulsive and inexperienced president to cut some deal with a foreign dictator in pursuit of what he thinks is in America's best interest, but is demonstrably not. Whether it's a withdrawal from NATO, withdrawal from the South Korean peninsula, a failure to defend peaceful protest in Hong Kong, or to stand with the people of Taiwan if they come under increased pressure. There's lots of places around the world where the fact that the United States keeps its word and keeps its commitments have been absolutely critical to regional stability and security. And I think this may not be the last time that President Trump stuns all of us with a move of this kind.
Senator, we'll ask you a little further about that in a moment. But first, let's just get you a little more on the facts on the ground right now in Syria. We've seen these last couple of reports, the idea that there might be a few hundred troops left, there might be shifted some to Iraq. Does that do anything at all in your mind to stabilize the situation there?
It may make it less bad, but frankly, the harm that was done, first to our reputation, can't be undone. Second, the hundreds of ISIS fighters who've now slipped out of their detention and are unaccounted for, it may prevent that from getting more rapidly worse, but not by much, because frankly, as Joe said in his lead-in question, it's hard to imagine what it is that's now going to be the circumstances on the ground. That's not at all clear. How far into Syria are the Turks going to go? How long will they stay? What sort of control will they exercise? How far north are Assad's forces, backed by Russian air power, backed by Iranian irregulars in the RGC? How far are they going to go? It is critical that we keep our base at Al-Tanf to protect against an east-west flow from Iraq. But in the far north, in the northeast, in Deir ez-Zor, I really find it hard to believe that we're going to be able to protect those troops if President Trump turns and runs every time he gets barked at by a strongman like Erdogan.
And you bring up the ISIS fighters who are now unaccounted for. The president in the last week or so tried to strike what was meant, he believed, a reassuring tone, saying, well, they're not going to come to the United States. They'll be in Europe. So let me ask you about that. You mentioned the idea of the U.S. abandoning its commitments elsewhere, perhaps betraying its allies. What message is he sending to these European capitals where he's more or less saying, well, ISIS, that's your problem, not ours?
I did meet this week with an ambassador from a European country where a very lethal ISIS attack was carried out that was planned in Raqqa. That was heard loud and clear. These are some of our closest, most trusted, longest allies with whom we have fought shoulder to shoulder in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere in the Middle East, where we're currently doing important work against terrorism in West Africa. Frankly, this gives pause to all of our allies. It makes them wonder whether our president really is as aggressively isolationist and as ill-informed about the Middle East as he sounds.
Senator Trump's abrupt drawdown after one call with the Turkish dictator in Syria has really dominated the news, but at the same time, he is now deploying 3,000 additional troops to Saudi Arabia. Did the administration provide any justification to you and your colleagues on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for that move and that deployment?
No. And frankly, what concerns me even more is the president saying the reason they're going to Saudi Arabia is they're being paid for. Everything we've seen from President Trump about this region and about these recent decisions is either driven by money, we're securing oil, our troops are being paid for, or by a profound lack of grasp of the region and its recent history. The breadbasket of the Middle East, the place where an enormous amount of food has been grown for millennia, he describes as lots and lots of sand. I mean, I could go on at great length. More importantly, for reasons that I'm finding it hard to put my finger on, this is the issue that has caused Republicans in the Senate to finally stand up and challenge this president, to publicly express disagreement. Mitch McConnell published a very strong editorial denouncing this ill-advised move by President Trump. I am pointing out to them that he's not keeping a campaign commitment to bring our troops home. Instead, he's actually increasing the number of our troops that are at great risk by being right in the very center of the Iranian-Saudi conflict. And the Saudis, I'll remind you, are not our most reliable ally from a values perspective.
Well, will the Senate debate, though, a new authorization of military force, AUMF? So that when is that going to happen? No.
On the Foreign Relations Committee, we should be having many more hearings. We have had one about Iran. We should have many more hearings about what has just happened in Syria, what's happening in the Saudi kingdom and the region. All of this is connected. And frankly, right now, all of this, these recent moves by President Trump, hands territory and advantage to some of our most difficult opponents. Russia, Iran, and obviously Bashar al-Assad. This is one of the reasons I continue to be enthusiastic about Joe Biden as a candidate for president. He would restore and stabilize a lot of our position on the world stage. He has deep knowledge of these areas. He's been to these countries dozens of times. He would not be making these same mistakes.
So, Senator, just imagine that the next president is still President Trump, a second term of President Trump. We're talking now on Syria. But when you look around the world at our commitments, at our posture, at our alliances, what is your worry about what a second Trump term would look like in terms of the president's priorities and what he would do with NATO or with South Korea?
I am gravely concerned that President Trump sees the value of our troops being on the Korean Peninsula or in Western Europe solely in terms of funding, that he harangues and harasses and pressures our allies as if there is some decades-old unpaid bar tab for the security and stability of the world. The American people have demonstrably benefited from our alliances in NATO, in East Asia, and in the Indo-Pacific. That is a lot of what has produced security, prosperity, stability over the last 7 decades. We designed and built a world order, and our troops around the world have played an absolutely central role in making that possible. I do think President Trump will continue to destabilize these alliances. He is achieving the long-term strategic goals of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, threatening our withdrawal from South Korea and Japan, and profoundly weakening the NATO alliance that so many fought so hard to strengthen and to stabilize in the recent years.
So let me ask you, Senator, the New York Times just released a story today saying that Donald Trump has ordered and quietly pulled 2,000 troops out of Afghanistan over the past year, even though there's been no peace deal with the Taliban. Obviously, the troops are there for one purpose, one main purpose, and that is to stop the next 9/11 from happening, to stop the spread of terrorism across that region, to protect, to stop them there before they start blowing up buildings in the United States again. What's your reaction to the president now moving to get us out of Afghanistan and strike a deal with the Taliban?
Well, frankly, there is broadly in the United States war weariness, and President Trump constantly refers to bringing our troops home and ending the so-called endless wars in Southwest Asia and the Middle East. There are two very different ways to resolve a conflict. One is, as we just saw in Syria, abrupt, ill-conceived, ill-planned. It leaves our allies puzzled or weakened, and it encourages our adversaries, and it puts our troops at risk. The other would be to leave in a measured and thoughtful way, having achieved some stabilization and some peace agreement. That's what's being attempted in Afghanistan. But to draw down our troops by several thousand when the Taliban have not only not been able to come to a peace agreement, but where the president's sort of fumbling around about inviting them to Camp David for a reality TV-style surprise reveal meeting between the Taliban and the president of Afghanistan was a striking misstep. This is just one more reminder that President Trump is the very first president in our history with no previous service, either military or elected, to undergird his leadership and to give him insights into how to conduct foreign policy. He also just willfully ignores the advice of the intelligence community, of diplomats, and of generals. Joe Biden as president would be a fundamentally different leader, someone who would rely on the advice of seasoned and senior professionals, someone who has visited troops in Iraq and Afghanistan literally dozens of times, and who understands and takes seriously the enormous amount of sacrifice that's been made. He would not simply draw down and ultimately abandon Afghanistan without some strong and clear path forward. And I think the contrast between these two leaders couldn't be more stark.
Well, so since you brought up Joe Biden twice, I need to ask you, do you think that Hunter Biden should have been in Ukraine working for an energy company while Joe Biden was going over there being responsible to clean up the country?
Well, let's be clear. Everyone who has looked at the facts of these allegations has concluded that Joe Biden did nothing wrong, that he was carrying out the policy of the Obama administration, of the EU, frankly, of the entire world community.
Senator, I agree with that. And of course, as I say repeatedly, the Wall Street Journal has said that he has done nothing wrong. I just wonder if you agree with Ed Luce with the Financial Times, though, that this still is soft nepotism. His son, who had no skill sets that would have allowed him to be on the board of an energy company or a consultant to an energy company to take money out of Ukraine. Should he have been there, or was that a mistake? Was it a mistake for him to be flying over on the vice president's plane to China to get money from a business venture in China? Was that a mistake in retrospect?
Joe, I think Beau has spoken to that directly and has said as much. I've known Beau for decades, and I frankly think...
Hunter.
I'm sorry. Forgive me.
That's okay.
No, I've made the mistake myself.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Forgive me. Hunter has spoken directly to this recently in a national television interview where I thought he was remarkably forthcoming and has expressed regret about the ways in which this has become a distraction in his father's campaign for president of the United States. I think to make a comparison between the two, between Trump and Biden and the way they've conducted themselves, is not a fair comparison.
No, there's no comparison.
To have an honest conversation about this, we just have to put things in context. And it just doesn't help. And
Agreed.
It's, the kind of thing that Trump feasts upon, manipulates, and then spews out and uses this as his background for, what potentially crimes he's committing with our foreign policy. But I think,
Mika,
if we can't have an honest conversation about
correct.
whether or not it's okay for, I don't think it was a good idea, but it was not illegal, and it's been investigated. But I think we need to be honest that
Agreed.
That's where it all began. It's not a good idea.
And also that it was very, very bad judgment. All right. Well, we'll leave it there.
Yeah.
Senator Chris Coons, thank you so much for being with us. We greatly appreciate it. Coming up, an off-the-rails job interview likened to a Saturday Night Live skit.
Staff leaked schedules, secret meetings were just some of the scenes described in a new book by former Veterans Affairs Secretary David Shulkin. We'll ask him about his tumultuous 15-month tenure ending in a Twitter firing by President Trump. When Morning Joe comes right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.